Thank you all for coming tonight. Monsieur Le Clézio, thank you especially. I was going to say to welcome you to America, but of course you need no welcoming to America since you are in many ways effectively here all the time. In fact, you come to us tonight from that French outpost of Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Yes, yes, this is true. I have been living for more than 10 years in New Mexico now, so I'm more New Mexican than anything else.
What brought you to New Mexico? What was it that lured you to Albuquerque? We were talking just now about the incredible, almost mystical beauty of the New Mexican landscape.
Well, it's a long story. I was living in Mexico for a long time. I was teaching and an investigator in a small college in central part of Mexico, in Michoacan. And the situation got rather bad because for people having small children, it was kind of dangerous. So my wife and I, we decided to move. And we did like most people in Mexico, we crossed the border. And on the other side was New Mexico.
Not in the back of a truck, though.
So we settled there, and I was teaching at UNM after having taught in Michoacan. I was teaching at University of New Mexico for a while.
You know America extraordinarily well. I got a letter when it was announced that we were going to be talking together from someone at Mississippi State talking about your visit to Mississippi State and how wonderfully it had gone, wishing that they could come up. You've been not just in America, but all over America.
Well, yes, I've traveled quite a lot in the U.S., also in Latin America. I like very much the New World. To me, it's appealing. There is
one of the things that's distinctive in your work is exactly its geographic range, is the habit of travel, the habit of voyaging. But as I've read about you, that isn't something that you acquired later on. It's in some ways in your DNA. It was your natural language as a child.
Well, yes. You know, I'm from my origin. I am a Briton from Brittany, and those people were very poor, like the Irish. So whenever they could, they left Brittany to find a better world. And my ancestors left Brittany. They went to Mauritius. They settled there, and Mauritius is an island. It's very small, so very soon they had to leave this place. My father was a medical officer in Nigeria, in British Guiana first, and then in Nigeria. One of my uncles was a doctor in Trinidad. Another one was in Reunion Island. Some of my aunts went to live in South Africa. I think we are nearly everywhere.
So
you could find.
On your father's side, English speakers, or?
Yes, not really English speakers, because in Mauritius you speak French, English, and Creole. So their real language was Creole. But then they took on French and they took on English. English was for scientific matters at school. French was more for literary things. So and Creole was for the general life. So they used to speak those three languages.
So that idea of a kind of a creolized society, of an idea that there is no one authentic language or one true culture, is sort of very, very essential to you.
Well, yes, because I strongly believe that creolization is a good thing. You have to mix and you have to change your identity and to adapt to a new way of life, especially when you travel. And the lesson I received from my parents was that we have to adapt. We have to find new places and new way of lives. And my mother went back at the beginning of the war. She went back to France to see her family, her parents. My father was in Nigeria, so I was brought up in south of France. I was born, in fact, in south of France during the war. And but I always thought that I did not belong really to that place, that one day I would probably go to Mauritius or maybe to some other place. And when my father retired from the military, the British military, he was looking for a warm place to live in. So he was thinking in Bermuda or in Bahamas. He was thinking about Malta Islands. For some reason, he didn't want to go back to Mauritius. Maybe he had some problems there. And eventually he settled in Nice, which was warm enough for him. And he not really appreciated life there, but he accepted that.
And you ended up being there through the Second World War as a young boy.
Yes, it's a strange experience when I realized that all my early childhood was during war. One of my early memories is a bomb falling on very close to my grandmother's home where we were living, and the ground was shaking. And this bomb was dropped by Canadians because there were some Germans in Nice. They didn't want to.
By Canadians, really?
Yeah, by
oh,
Canadians.
we apologize.
Well, it was for the good. It was for the good reason to get rid of the Germans. But still, I remember the noise and I remember falling on the ground and shrieking. So when I think about war, it's a personal experience. It's not something I read in the books.
And it returns as a theme in so much of your writing, the experience of children at war and conflict, as in
yes.
Wandering Star, that extraordinary novel about.
Yes, because I don't have a historical knowledge of what happened. Mm-hmm. Well, I read books afterwards, but my first knowledge is personal. It's made of feelings, of sensation. I suffered from hunger. I remember having been very hungry. And I still remember being on the road and the Americans are coming and I am begging for food. Like sometimes you see those images in the newspaper in Darfur, soldiers passing by and children begging for food. I begged for food and they threw me some chewing gum, some very good white bread made probably of very enriched flour, this very white type of flour.
Wonder bread.
Wonder bread, exactly. And a box of Spam. And those three things, for me, they were the beginning of life because I had been eating topinamburs, those yes. Half-rotten roots. And suddenly I met real food. Spam was real food.
Well, that's a great moment in Franco-American relations. We sent Spam and Wonder Bread. They gave us back Le Clézio. So I'll take the deal. But one of the things that makes your work so arresting and original is the combination of its extraordinarily cosmopolitan point of view, which we've been talking about, and yet the extraordinary purity and beauty of your French. The French language is another country for you. It's a place you've lived your whole life.
Yes, because being from Mauritius, I felt I had not really I couldn't call any place my country. France was not really my country. It was a country where I was living, but it was not my country. My country was in imagination, and it was difficult to explain to my fellow students, my comrades. It was very difficult to explain to them. I'm from Mauritius. They would not know at that time what was Mauritius. They were saying, "Oh yes, Saint Maurice. Where would that be?" So Saint Maurice was a part of Nice, a place where I was born. Right. So I would say, no, I would say it's a bit further. It's not that close. But I could not explain what I was to what I really belonged. So I had to find a place where I would belong, where I would find myself. And this place were books, in reading books. And fortunately, my grandmother and my grandfather had a very good library. They had a very good collection of books. And I read most of the French, Spanish, English literature when I was a child. There were no books for children. So I was reading El Quijote when I was a child, like if it was a book meant for children. Lazarillo de Tormes, I was reading Ingoldsby Legends. I was reading those books as my first books. And I felt that the language was my real place. And I began to write. I began to feel I could pertain to this world, to the books. I was really a lover of books, and especially of dictionaries. I really enjoy very much going through dictionaries.
Just reading a dictionary as a novel.
Yes. There were those French dictionary. There was the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is a marvelous source of knowledge.
The illustrated Larousse
Yes.
dictionary, that's such a beautiful.
Yes, it's very beautiful. It's amazing because I still see life through those pages, so those definitions of this time. And there was a collection of dictionaries, a very extraordinary collection called Dictionnaire de la Conversation, conversation dictionaries, which were meant for young women of the 19th century in order to that they would not humiliate their husbands. So they would go through
Polite conversation that they could.
for light conversation, but good knowledge on historical subject matters or on any,
Oh, it was a way of getting educated, so you would know what to
get
say
educated.
about a
Because
subject.
women would not go to school in the 19th century,
Right.
so it was one way of being educated. And so I was reading those books, and I have a strange perception of the world through those articles.
Well, but you know, when you say that, it makes me think about your early work especially, because one of the things that's so striking in it is its extreme precision, is your search for precision. May I read something? May I read a favorite quote of yours, if you'll forgive me in my own bad translation?
Okay, please do.
But you wrote in 1967, I think, "I am a lover of details. I love all that is small. I have respect for animals and for objects. The closer they can be held, the more they please me. We all have an imprecise image of life. Mine is made of small details. A room, for instance, with Bibelot Bon Marché, a worn rug, a fly, cigarette ashes in an ashtray, and then you go on to describe beautifully the contents of a single room. And you end by saying, in my room, in the street, the city, on all the earth, and even elsewhere, there are many small gods, and I prostrate myself before each of them." Was that a kind of credo of your work early on?
Well, I for a long time I thought that writing would be a kind of enumeration of words, enumeration of things and of words. And I remember one of the first modern authors I read was Jerome David Salinger, and I heard that he was he used to go to a small hut in his backyard, and he would write words on a paper. He would make an enumeration of words. I said to myself, "This is writing. This is a good writer. I should do the same." So I was trying to imitate Salinger in enumerating things, enumerating words, and then choosing them and using them, because each word is a word by itself, and it opens on a scenario, on a story, or a legend, a myth. Every word contains a world.
Nicely said. I actually wanted to ask you about Salinger, because I've noticed that in your comments on your own work, Salinger came up very early for you, and of course he's one of the local gods of my office. What was it the idea of enumerating words, but also would we be wrong to think also the ability to inhabit the mind of an adolescent, the mind of a youth?
Yes,
in Catcher in the Rye?
This was amazing because when he writes that, he's very far from that age. And I was reading this book, I was around 17, 18, so I was already far from Caulfield. I was already separated by years. But I think I was also attracted by Salinger because he had a very humoristic way of telling tragic things. There is a short story I really like enormously, which is A Perfect Day for the Banana Fish. Mm-hmm. This is I think one of the best short stories ever written. And it stages a very strange happening in England, where Ernest Hemingway gets into a barrack where the soldier, probably Salinger, was. And Ernest Hemingway is a real author with the authority, an author with authority, and he speaks loud, and he tells tall tales, and he's very braggant, very vigorous. And the hero of that short story is reluctant, and he shrinks in front of such authority. And I felt this is probably one of the reality of literature, is that there might be a confrontation between power, what you call power, and this inner self that expresses literature.
The soul of literature is against
the soul.
the
And he was
against
closer,
the show of literature.
He was closer to the soul, and Hemingway was closer to the power. And so power to me means something static, and the inner self, the soul, means something very difficult to define and very moving all the time, not steady.
That's fascinating because it makes me think about your work in a sense has been a series of escapes in some ways to keep yourself close to the soul of literature and away from the power of literature.
Yes, to keep close to this hero of The Perfect Day for the Banana Fish, to have this kind of evasive perception of the world, not full of details, but incapable of reaching a point where you say, I know something. You never know something. Literature is the contrary of knowledge. It's asking questions. It's totally the contrary of affirmation.
Or having a message, or
having a message. Yes, yes, because those were, I think, because somehow I lived the same years as Salinger, and also all the people who lived after the war. They were not sure of anything. The world that crumbled down, literally, especially in Europe.
After the Second World War.
After the Second World War, when I was from 10 to 15 years old, we were sure of absolutely nothing. And at the end of this period came a terrible other war, which was the Algerian War, for which I was drafted. Normally I should have gone to fight in Algeria for the colonialist power. So those were terrible times. And after that, you could not believe in a message of literature. You could not believe in commitment in literature. Literature could not give lessons. Literature would just be able to question and to express your angst, your anger, your angst, and sometimes your derision, but not be able to give you security.
So I had not thought of this, but in a way, your first 15 or 20 years of your work is a kind of negation of the sort of tradition of the literature engagée of Malraux and those kinds of master thinkers.
Yes, not that I didn't like it. I enjoyed reading La Condition Humaine, Human Condition, and reading the plays by Sartre. They are fabulous, the plays by Sartre. But in some ways, those authors failed. I don't know why. Maybe my generation failed. Or maybe
all generations fail.
Maybe. And definitely the failure was the Algerian War. After the Second World War, in France especially, the Algerian War was the most terrible thing which would happen, because people were trying to impose to another nation a colonial power. This is impossible to admit. So I felt reluctant to... I wanted to leave France. I wanted to live in Sweden, or to live in England, or in Canada maybe. I was looking to emigrate to Canada, because those places were so far from the reality of war which we were living in. And
of colonial war, particularly.
Colonial war, yes.
Particularly. And yet I've always imagined, in a way, a kind of subterranean, a clandestine dialogue between you and Camus. Do you feel that somewhat?
I really liked Camus, because he was, in some ways, he was not giving affirmations. Even when, during his Nobel Prize speech, even said a few words which were terrible, because he said he could not choose between the Algerian independence and the love he had for his native land and for his mother. And so he was showing some kind of weakness, and for this I loved him. I thought this is a good writer because he's able to show his weakness. He's not...
witness to contradiction and to...
Witness with contradictions, yes. Which was probably in his mind anyway, because he was convinced that the world had no other meaning than the meaning we could give, we could want the world to be. This apparent contradiction I really enjoyed in Camus.
That's a kind of, it's a theme of your work too, it seems to me, that is the contradictions of experience, the contradictions of consciousness.
Yes.
And you never like to resolve anything in simplicity.
Yes. And furthermore, there was another link that I spent most of my childhood on the Mediterranean Sea, and Algeria was just on the other side of that sea, and some of my friends at school died in Algeria. They were killed. As soon as they arrived there, they were killed. So I had the feeling that I was very close to this amazingly sharp world with such a strong light, beautiful sceneries, a beautiful sea, and all this was giving angst and was giving fear of the war. And so this, I think, was an important part of my education. It was a way of, after that, trying to read the Greek philosophers and finding that they were giving me the same angst, the same questions about being. What is being? It's a sunny country, so you should not normally ask those questions. But still it's there. It's very strongly there. When you read Parmenid, there is an angst in Parmenid or in the pre-Socratic philosophers. It's full of angst, full of questions.
And it's part of the landscape of that world.
Yes. I found, in a vain way, I found myself very, very lucky to have been, to have grown up in such a place, in such a scenery. Because reading those texts, reading about Camus, and doing that outside in the shade of an olive tree, I felt that it was kind of privilege.
In a direct path from the pre-Socratics to the...
This was rather vain because you don't choose those places, they are there.
Yeah. And yet landscape plays a hugely important role in all of your writing, doesn't it?
Yes, I was a strong believer of writing outside. For a long time I was going outside, en plein air, at the beach even. Sometimes I was taking books at the beach and reading in the sun. And I felt that this connection between light, the sun, the way of the sun, because the sun is sometimes very, very, very strong there, and feeling the strength of nature and being able to do that outside, it was also a privilege. I could not do that in Paris or in London, or I would have had to do that under an umbrella.
But in all of your work, or in much of your work at least, one of the things that's striking about it is that you intermingle human consciousness with animal consciousness, with the simple existence of the inarticulate world. And so that you always have a simultaneous sense of the human minds going on, but also of the permanent existence of the planet.
Well, yes, because I don't feel that human beings are very different from the rest of the creation. We all belong to the same world, and we all partake of this world. We share everything in that world. And in the human beings, we have also the same pulsions and the same instincts, and sometimes even the same language, the same impulsions, the same dreams as the animals and probably the vegetation. We all belong to this expression. So this was the novel. You know, is a good, is a very pleasant way of writing, because in the novel you can put all this. You can feed the novel with all these different pulsions. You tell a story. You invent people. You make them talk, but at the same time, you see them in their surroundings. You can see how they are surrounded by plants, by trees. You can even conceive that towns are a part of nature, that they are a production of nature, that everything is connected, is linked. And this is very good to write with all this material in a book, and this is called a novel. That's why I like writing novels.
But a student of your work once said, or a reader of your work once said, that one of your ambitions in a kind, if you had to describe it in a phrase, it would be a humanism without human beings at the center. That is, with values of humanism, but without the notion of the human being as the sole controller and consciousness of the world.
Well, I wish I could do that, but I am a human being, so everything I do is from a human being point of view. But I like to imagine sometimes, and I like to read in books. There are many books in which you can find this moving and troubling sense of something which is not entirely human. You find that in the ancient books, like the Indian books from India. The Mahabharata, for instance, is an extraordinary book where the forest has such a role in the story. The forest is surrounding the heroes, and the forest acts and has a philosophical meaning in the story of humanity. Or in some poems, like Rimbaud's poems, you can feel strongly the impulsion coming from the light, from the sun. He says in one of his poems, he says, what he likes is to roam in dirty streets and suddenly feel the sun on his face. And he says, the sun, the god of fire. And this, it's astonishing. When I read this, it makes me shiver.
People who have followed your work sometimes say that your first books, the book that was called The Interrogation in English translation and so on, were seen as being in some way related to the movement called the New Novel in France, and that as you went on, there was a break in your work where you became less aggressively experimental and more accessible. Do you see that as a break, or do you see it as an evolution of a single project?
Well, yeah, it's probably both. When I published The Interrogation, I was in France. I was 22 years old. Mm-hmm. So when you are 22, you want to break doors. You have to be violent. To say that you exist is what you want to say. I am here. I exist, and I want to say something. But then, as the years are passing by and your life is changing, you have good and bad experiments, and you change, and you begin to understand that your aim is not necessarily to say I exist, but to try to be the vector, to be the passage for something else, something which you perceive and you want to transmit. And it's probably the reason why I was less aggressive after that. Mm-hmm. But in fact, I never felt I was linked to the new novel, because I remember when I sent my first book to the publisher, it was together with a letter addressed to the editor saying, this is not a new novel. Be careful, this is not a new novel. So I wanted to make a strong separation. And in fact, at that time, I felt more linked to the so-called New York Jewish novel, Malamud, Salinger. I felt more attracted by that because those writers were speaking about rebellion, and I didn't find that in the new novel, in the Nouveau Roman. Mm. The Nouveau Roman was just a reaction against the commitment literature. It was a kind of abstraction if you compare to Sartre and
of the previous generation.
To the previous generation, the generation which followed the war. So the only novel I really appreciated were the novel by Nathalie Sarraute, and her idea of the l'ère du soupçon, the era of, how do you say soupçon? The
suspicion,
era of
mistrust.
The era of mistrust, of suspicion. And this was really what I felt. I felt a strong suspicion towards the previous French literature. Mm-hmm. We wanted to, or even to Steinbeck type of literature, wanted to.
Hemingway too.
Hemingway,
right.
Especially Hemingway. That's true.
The kind of literature that wanted to conquer the world in some way.
And to deliver a message to the world and say, those are the solutions. And in fact, those were the moments where for instance, the socialism in Russia and China were committing crimes. And the intellectuals of that time never never denounced the crimes. They were
Partisans of them.
yes, and they were denying the crimes. I remember the people going to China, and they never saw what was happening there, or they were blind, maybe, I don't know. So,
or chose not to see. Or
era of suspicion is a good definition of that period of time.
But as the decades have gone on, in France at least, you're perceived as someone who has brought a kind of message, and that is the message, if you like, of the existence of a world outside our world, that the world is not defined by the narrow preoccupations of Paris or New York or the little nut of Western civilization.
Yes, indeed, I felt very much that way because, in fact, I didn't live in Paris. I never was living in Paris.
That's true. You've never actually lived in Paris until very recently.
No, I was reluctant. When I got the prize, I was in Nice, and my father said, "I'll take the train, go to Paris.
And celebrate.
You belong to there, you have to go there." And I was answering him, well, what should I do in Paris? What shall I do there? And they were asking for pictures. So I went to those automatic pictures, and I sent automatic picture to the publisher.
This is when you won the Prix Renaudot.
Yes.
When in that. So you went to one of those things where you got the strip of photographs? And
yes, I sent them. Sorry, sore throat. And after that, I felt very strongly the beginning of a new era in literature, which was the era of the people writing in French, and which people who belonged to the former French colonies and who were taking on French to write their own stories. Sorry, I have
you take your time. Do you need it?
I have
you have here.
Small pen, yes.
You can show that.
It's even it's called indictments.
And you can't see this from the audience, but it shows various members of the previous administration, and it's called indictments.
Indictments.
But you were saying you were aware that there was a new kind of literature to be written in French outside Paris.
Yes, definitely outside Paris. In fact, Paris was a village, and the French language was extending itself to the entire world. And the people writing in those in those forgotten places were Frantz Fanon, for instance, the Earth, the Wretched of the Earth, extraordinary book by Frantz Fanon. And people like Édouard Glissant or Aimé Césaire from the Martinique Islands, who wrote an extraordinary book of poetry called Cahier d'un retour au pays natal, a notebook from a return to the homeland. And all those people writing about their experience of colonialism and their will to be free, their need to be free. And one of them, one of the good writers of that time, is Dewe Gorode from New Caledonia, who was put in jail by the French because she was claiming for the independence of New Caledonia. And she wrote very good poetry, very good novels, and she even wrote a very interesting speech in which she says that the Kanak people from New Caledonia cannot be independent until they know how to treat women, because they have a strong machist way of life. So all these people were giving a new breath to in French literature, a new space, a new future, and this was what really followed. This was really a new novel and a new poetry.
This was the real new novel.
The real new novel and the real new poetry in French literature. And it's very much so now, until now. The best writers now in French literature are writers from Africa, from the West Indies, from Quebec, like the poetess Rita the way she talks to the salmon, and who is fighting also against the multinationals who want to build a dam on her river, on the river Romaine. She's fighting for that. So those are the people who have something to say, and it's beautiful that they use the French language. I'm very much honored by that, and if the French culture has had the guilt of being a slave trading and a colonialist culture, now they are forgiven by the use of French for those different countries. So
and part of your project, part of your life has been spent bearing witness to that new French, to a new use of the language.
yes, I was very much sensitive to the wrongs of colonization, because as I was born during the war, so I have a personal knowledge of war. I have also been, when I was a child, to Africa, to Nigeria, to meet my father. And these were the times of colonialization of Nigeria by the British, and it was not better than the French colonization. It was terrible. So I still remember very violent images, African people walking as in a chain gang on the roads. They were under the sun, and they were led to a place where they would build a swimming pool of the district officer, who was looking at that, not moving, with his white helmet and his colonial garment, colonial clothes. And I remember this sight. It's something striking, slightly ridiculous, and at the same time horrible. So this was a kind of privilege also to have been witness to those times, because really when I read about slave trade, when I read about those times, I know what it means. I've seen scenes like those. I've seen that with my eyes. And my father was a medical doctor in Nigeria, and he was strongly against colonialism, though he belonged to the system,
club, right.
But he was strongly against that. And he was persuaded that it was wrong to be there in such a system. And I think his influence was capital for me. So this is what I'm made of, those images and those teaching from my own family. And also the fact that being from Mauritius, I come also from a colonialist family, because in the past, the French people in Mauritius, they traded slaves, and they imported coolies from China, from India, the same way as the people did in the southern states of the US. So all those things to me are connected. For instance, when I read Faulkner, I understand very well what he speaks about, because I belong to, in certain ways, to the same culture.
To the slave-owning culture, in a sense.
I know what it means. And I have the same feeling of guilt and the same feeling of compassion and the same urge of seeing the things change, that the world would be a true and just place, not a place of injustice as it still is now.
It strikes me as we talk that it has absolute reality for you. In other words, that the history of colonialism and enslavement isn't something that you can easily put off as being part of a remote past. For you, it's happening now, in a sense. It still weighs on you.
Yes, and I think I am unable to write about things I have not seen or I have not been told about. If you tell me something, then I could write about it, but I can't dare to imagine things, for instance, to write a historical novel. I could not dare to speak, for instance, about the Jewish leaving Saint-Martin and trying to cross the Alps. I could dare to speak about that, to write about that, because my mother told me that story, which is not very well known. So when I heard a story, or when I have seen something, or when I've been told something, then it's a beginning of literature. Then it can be changed into into a novel, into a legend, into a poem, or into any shape, but literary shape.
It has to be tangible. It has to be a particular story.
It has to be seen through the eyes, either through my eyes or through your eyes. I have to have that real connection with the memory.
That's one of your most beautiful novels, in my view, is the novel called Wandering Star in English, which tells simultaneously the story of a Jewish girl at the creation of the State of Israel and of a Palestinian girl at the same time. It's a sort of perfect example, it would seem to me, of your desire to have a novel that bears witness but bears no message, in a sense.
Yes, because it's linked also with my childhood in the backcountry of Nice. Being British, my mother and my grandmother, my grandfather, being British because they were from Mauritius, they had to flee from Nice because the Germans were coming. And so we went hiding in the mountains. And we didn't know at that time that in the next village, about 6 miles from the place where we were, was the place where the Italians had gathered the Jewish people from the coast. And shortly after the war, my mother began to talk about that. And then when I was older, she told me the whole story. And for me, it was extraordinary that I had been so close to this drama. And I wanted very much to write about that because I felt I had been part of it in some ways. I was there. Maybe I had seen some of the children who were then taken by the Germans and sent to the death camps. So I felt I had to write about that, not because I felt I could do something about it, but I wanted to free myself in a certain way of this terrible history and grand history at the same time. So I wanted to write a novel first about this moment. My mother told me about what had happened. And then I had begun a short story about a Palestinian camp. And I was thinking of publishing that separately. And for some reason, I saw at a certain moment that they would be linked. And I wrote the novel, and then I said, is that a caricature I'm writing? Because it's too much, too similar. And then I do not want to express the idea that the Palestinian people were living the same thing as the Jewish people had lived. And I was reluctant to publish it. And this lasted for years, because at the same moment I was writing that short story about the Palestinian camp, began the first Intifada. So I said, I can't publish it now, because it looks as if I was taking advantage of the actuality, and I was making profit of this. So I hold it for some years, and then slowly I took it again, and in some ways it managed to get together, and I managed to end the book, but I canceled a part of the book. There was also a part of the book which was taking place in Lebanon. And all this I suppressed.
Because?
Because it felt too much, too close to actuality. I wanted it to be a novel, not to be a kind of pamphlet.
Reportage of.
Yes, reportage or pamphlet. So I decided to keep that in the shape of a novel. So it lasted 4 years. It's a book took me about 4 or 5 years to complete.
And yet it does represent quite beautifully, it seems to me, for lack of a better phrase, the common humanity of these two experiences.
Yes, for me it was really the motivation was to complete a memory. I had received from my mother a memory.
So many years ago.
So many years ago. I felt I had been a witness of what had happened in the South Alps in France. And at the same time, I felt I was a contemporary witness of what was happening in Palestine. And I wanted in some ways that those two, the memory and the extrapolation, the imagination from coming from my readings of the papers. I've never been to Israel or to Palestine. The first time I went there, I went through Jordan. I wanted to cross the river, but something happened and the border was closed. So I went back to Amman. I've never been there.
Oh, really?
No.
Because it's a beautiful evocation of landscape and light.
I saw it from far. I was on the cliff on the other side. I saw Jerusalem shining in the far.
That seems to be a pattern in your life of being just outside and seeing from
being at the border.
Being at the border. Being at the border. Something you addressed, I want to turn the conversation over to the audience in a moment, but something you addressed in your Nobel lecture was the question of whether this new world that's coming into being, whatever one calls it, the South, the third world, the dispossessed world, whether it can find a voice, of its own that can participate, not just contribute, but can find its own autonomy. How do you see that? And can literature genuinely play a role in the 21st century?
Yes, I feel strongly that literature is one of the ways to achieve interculturality. If we don't achieve it through words and through imagination, then it will never be possible. It has to exist first in the books and in the imagination. The fact that all cultures have a right to express themselves, and that there is no culture better than the other, that all cultures, they are not alike, but they have a right to the general concert of the human spirit. So literature is a good way for this. It's why I'm so happy to have been invited by the Pen Club, because it's a rare occasion of being able to hear the world voices. World voices, it's a beautiful phrase to say it, world voices. We have to listen to the world voices, and I think literature is a good way to listen to the world voices, because novelists and poets are probably the people who are less concerned with power. They are less concerned with politics. Sometimes they suffer from politics. Sometimes they suffered from censorship, or even sometimes they are jailed. They are even sometimes killed. This happens, unfortunately. But novelists have this freedom of mind because they make with their heroes, with their words and with their heroes, they give us a sort of play, a theatrical play, which is not only played, which is felt from the inside. I mean, when you read a novel, at a certain point you get inside the novel. You are taken or swallowed by the novel. If I read The Catcher in the Rye, I am Holden Caulfield. I can't deny it. At a certain point, I am inside his head, his body. And being inside others, changing your personality, even when you write, helps to a better understanding, because it's a way of going towards the others, of understanding the others. If we read Dewe Gorode, we can't deny the fact that what she says is right. What she says about New Caledonia is right. I am a New Caledonian when I read that, and I strongly feel what she says, what she asks for. And when I read Richard Wright, I feel that also. Each time I read a novel which enthralls me, then I live my personal identity, and I am beginning to be the other. I think that is the
literature
key.
Is our most powerful means to inhabit the other.
Exactly. It's the best way to understand and to begin to love the others, to be close to the others. I strongly believe all this is a matter of love. There is this beautiful poem by Francisco de Quevedo, who says that love is the only dimension in the world, that it's the only real dimension of the world. And I think literature is made of that. Even when you read terrible novels, it's made with a compassion or a love for humanity. You can't deny it. It exists. Even the worst situations express this concern for the other.
We wouldn't write at all if we didn't feel that.
Of course, I'm sure that Frankenstein of Mary Shelley expresses something real, a real experience, of course, which she had lived through, but it expresses the preoccupation that there is a monster in us also, and knowing that we can be monsters helps also to cure ourselves.
Our monstrousness.
Monstrousness,
exactly.
That's right.
Well, speaking of the others, let us inhabit some of them if we can. I know some of you have questions. Good evening. And I know Monsieur Le Clézio would be delighted to take them. I think we have a microphone on the side here. So please come up and I will repeat them as well. Someone here? Please.
Hello. You talk about landscape so much. Seems it's a very important word for you. So my question is that how do you describe the landscape of your mind? And also the second question is, what novels are you reading now?
The questions were, how would you describe the landscape of your mind? And I'll leave you to answer that. And the other was, more practically, what novels have you been reading recently? Are you reading right now?
I answer to the second question first, because I'm reading the strange life of Equiano Olaudah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a marvelous book written in 1750 by an African who was taken from the Niger River and went to the United States, was sold as a slave in the United States, and had a very extraordinary life. Then he went with a captain and visited the Arctic Pole, and went back to Europe and back to the United States, traveled a lot and learned a lot about himself. And I'm reading that because he had a sister, I don't know if it's a twin sister, he mentions a sister who had been taken at the same time as himself, and we never know what happened to the sister, what happened to her. So it's a book with a blank half.
Sounds like the beginning of a novel.
Could be. But it's fascinating. It's not a novel, it's a diary.
It's
like
a memoir.
Diary, and it was so essential in the movement of abolition in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a magnificent book. And so this is what I'm reading now. And the other question, the landscape in my mind, I must say I'm very much attracted to the North Pole. I would like very much to be there. Sometimes I have a vision of a totally icy world without any plant.
Have you ever traveled to the Arctic?
No, never.
On behalf of Canada, I invite you, please.
Yes, it's a good way to get there. You go to Nunavut, and
exactly.
from Nunavut
you
reach the North Pole. So it's one of my dreams. I probably shall never do it. But then some of my nights are full with icy landscapes, shining under a very blue sky with a very strong sun.
Well, we must get you, and we must get you north. Gentleman here.
Yes, I have two unrelated questions. The first is, what research, if any, did you use when you wrote the short story, The Runner? And the second one is, when the Nobel Committee awarded the prize, they also made some caustic remarks about American readers and their seeming lack of interest in current world literature. I wonder if you had any comments about that.
Did you follow? The first question is
the first question
about The Runner.
escaped me totally.
The first question is, what research did you do for the short story, The Runner?
The Runner. What would be the title in French?
Le Courrier?
The Runner. L'échappée, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, the escape. Yes, exactly.
I didn't read anything. It was out of my mind, if I remember well. maybe I read in the newspaper in south of France about someone who had escaped from jail and was trying to hide in. There is a place very close to Nice in the south of France where they have this strange geological formation called dolines. Dolines are places where the ground collapses and it makes some sort of bowls in the stone. And so I wanted that person, this escapee, to take refuge inside one of those stone bowls.
Right. Let me turn the second question around, if the gentleman doesn't mind. Instead of asking about any imagined insult to America, let me ask you about the compliment to France. That is, when in your winning the Nobel Prize, it seemed to be, not a vindication, at least once again, reaffirming the centrality, the importance of French literature at a moment when many people have said that French literature no longer matters as it once did.
Yes, I understand the sense of the question. Unfortunately, I am Mauritian as well as French. I have two nationalities. I have two passports, so I belong to both nations. And furthermore, I don't think that literature has to be strictly connected to a nation, to a nationality. Literature is using a language, is making use of a language. Joseph Conrad, for instance, wrote in English, but he was not an Englishman. And
Samuel Beckett
wrote in French. He was Irish. So it doesn't belong. You don't belong to a nationality. You belong to the language in which you write. And so, for me, French is not a declining language at all, because, as I said, it's the language used by all the people around the world who need that language to communicate and to express themselves. And this language has changed. The French language used by Aimé Césaire or by Chamoiseau or by Alain Mabankou in the Congo has nothing to do with the language from Beaumarchais or from Voltaire. It's or from Rob Grillet. It's a totally different language. They not only because they use different words, but because they make it sing in another
different
way,
rhythm in
a
it.
different way. You can feel the rhythm, the song. And personally, I feel in many ways that I've been influenced by Creole. I'm not sure about that, but I feel in some way, maybe it's my will, I want to be influenced by Creole. But I like very much Creole language. I like Creole literature. The way they use simple expressions to mean something more elaborate. For instance, in French, you say tel père, tel fils, such father, such son.
Yes. What a father, what a son.
Yeah, exactly. In Creole, you say dilo canal, which means that you have a canal and the water runs in the canal. Right. So dilo canal means that the water runs on the same canal.
Like father, like son. But
it's like father, like son, but it's not an abstract way of saying that. Right. It's a very realistic
water runs
way.
in the canal.
Very full of image. And I like to use this
imagistic,
down-to-earth way of speaking. I think in that sense, I've been influenced by Creole. My grandfather used to talk to me in Creole, after all. So I've known the Cirandan, these questions and answers that all the children know in Mauritius when I was a child. Dilo dibout, la canne, dilo en pendant coco. I know all these. I can tell them to you if you want. It's a long series of questions and answers.
So it's deep in your soul. So in a sense, the prize is
in that sense,
compliment to French.
In that sense, not French from France, from Paris. It's the French literature, which has a very long story. It began a long time ago with the Serment de Strasbourg, and has evolved. Was used by Christine de Pisan, who was Italian, by Rabelais, by so many different people. So I'm part of this story.
Rabelais is a kind of Creole writer in that way too, isn't he?
He's very Creole.
Very Creole.
Right. Very Creole.
Very Creole.
Thank you.
Someone else. Lady here? Gentleman here, I'm sorry.
No, that's right. I was just wondering if you could tell us something that you learned from another writer, maybe a peer, and then something you'd learned about writing from a teacher or somebody older than you.
Something you've learned about writing from another writer, which we've been talking about all night, but something you learned about writing, particularly from a teacher.
Yes, I had a very good Greek and Latin teacher, and I think what I learned from him is that he was sometimes my teacher in French literature, and he gave me extraordinary marks. It's the only time in my life I had the maximum mark for a dissertation, for a paper, a paper I wrote. So it gave me confidence, because until that time I had no real public. I was writing my short stories, my little novels, giving them to my grandmother, who would say, "Oh, this is marvelous." But I was not sure about that. So this teacher was a great teacher in the old-fashioned way. He was an old-fashioned man, but really a very beautiful mind, very clear mind, and he helped me a lot to get confidence.
Wonderful. Lady here.
Your books have a strong social conscience and humanity. In your life, are you an activist pour des causes? I'm asking this because we don't hear your political voice on TV, and so I wanted to know if you're un militant des causes aussi.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last phrase.
Yes, I didn't catch it either.
Did you hear me now?
No, I heard the beginning, but I didn't catch. Are you? I heard are you, but I didn't hear the.
Un militant des causes.
See?
Un militant des causes. Pour les causes.
Oh, an active. Oh, do you have a cause? Oh, do you? So, did you follow the question that you're a writer of social conscience, obviously, but one doesn't hear your political views, specifically political views, very often. Are you an activist for a particular cause?
Not at all. Unfortunately, I am a writer, so I live mainly in closed places. The period where I was writing outside is terminated now. I don't do it anymore. So I write on an ordinary table in a room in Albuquerque. What I see through my window pane is a space of wasteland where the tumbleweeds are rolling. So I don't feel connected really to actuality. But sometimes I get indignated, like everyone, from what happens. For instance, when bombs were falling on Baghdad, I was reading in a newspaper that the bombs were weighing 4,000 pounds. And I remember that the bomb which fell close to my grandmother was weighing only 1,000 pounds. And I still remember the shake of the explosion. So I think, I can't help thinking, what do the kids in Baghdad feel when that bomb, which is about 3 times the power of the bomb which fell close to me, what do they feel when it falls close to them? I'm not speaking of what happens when it falls on them, but when it falls on the side, for their entire life, they will remember it. So those things give way to indignation. But then what can I do? I can write novels. Sometimes I put those things in the novels. But I'm very often reluctant to sign petitions or to participate to movements because I have the feeling it would be like sort of satisfaction.
Self-satisfaction.
Self-satisfaction. I would do that and then I would not think about it anymore. I still want to think about it. I don't want to forget it. But I just want to act with my words. It's the only thing I can do. I'm not able to go in the streets and yell. I'm not able to wage war to anybody. I don't think I'm even able to defend myself against a policeman. So what could I do? So but then when there was movements against the war in Iraq in Albuquerque, my daughter went in the streets and she participated in the manifestation, and I said, "Oh, that is very good." I was very happy that she did that. But myself, I must say, I'm not a man of action, not at all.
You're a man of words.
Unfortunately.
But you raised a daughter of action, which is the most
Well,
that...
she is the person of
woman
action. She chose that.
One more question, perhaps? Does someone have one last question?
Yes.
Let me repeat that for those who didn't hear it. In what way was Monsieur Le Clézio influenced, altered by his interactions with Native Americans in South America and in North America? Because that's been a very rich vein in your life.
Well, it's a long story because it began when I was a child. In those dictionaries I was reading, there were images of the Peruvian sculptures, and there were articles on the Peruvian civilization. And I read that, and it made me dream. It made me feel that something extraordinary had happened there, and that this extraordinary civilization had completely been wiped out. So I wanted to understand how it was possible that it had nearly disappeared. And I bought then later some books about the Inca civilization, then about the Aztec and Maya civilization. And then I had the good luck of doing my military service in part in Mexico. I was sent to Mexico. And then when I arrived in Mexico, I was struck by the fact that 80% of the population in Mexico are American Indians. When you see them in the streets, their physical aspect is they are American Indians, they are Aztec. They are still there. Their civilization in some ways have been changed, have disappeared, but the physical evidence is still there. And so slowly, little by little, I read more books, relations written by the Spaniards, some relations written by the Indians themselves, like Ixchiltzocitl in Mexico, or by the Peruvians. And I felt more and more attracted by this most extraordinary civilization, which had invented so extraordinary things that we live with in agriculture, the way they were dealing with huge cities,
architecture
and urbanism, the high civilization they had reached at the moment of the conquest by the Spaniards, by the French, and by the English. And little by little, I felt that there was a part of the world knowledge that which was completely
vanished.
Not vanished, but ignored. It was not known. And I've never been a militant for those movements, but still, each time I can, I speak about what is happening. For instance, I was telling about Rita Mestokosho from the Innu tribe in Quebec. She's fighting to avoid that her valley, the Roman River Valley, should be wiped out by the flooding caused by Hydro-Quebec, the Hydro-Quebec company. So it's a village of about 400 persons who fights against one of the richest, most powerful companies in the world. There is a kind of romanticism in that, but still, I think it's a true and just fight she's fighting for. And most Native Americans have revendication. They have issues which resemble very much that of Rita Mestokosho in New Mexico, in Arizona, but also in Mexico, in Peru, in Ecuador. And at the same time, it's interesting to see that the interculturality has been achieved, for instance, in Ecuador, in Bolivia. The children are brought up in 3 languages in school. They have their own native language, another native language, and then Spanish. And so it exists. Interculturality has been achieved in those areas. So if you rank societies and civilizations, considering what would be the highest level, in interculturality, that would be Bolivia and Ecuador.
Okay. And not France or America.
Not France at all. Not at all.
Not at all. I have to ask you, Monsieur Le Clézio, if you would tell, just as we come to a close, the story about how you learned that you had won the Nobel Prize last year.
Yes. Well, I was in Paris for a short while because my daughters live in Paris. So with my wife, we were in Paris in a small apartment we lived in when we are in Paris. And the telephone rang, and my wife took the telephone, and someone said with a strong accent, "This is so-and-so from the Swedish Academy." And so she hung me the telephone and said, "This is for you." That's the way.
It's a good marriage. When let me think. If you can tolerate, because we're kicking off the Penn Festival tonight, if you can tolerate it, Monsieur Le Clézio, let me just read a few brief words of yours, because I think that they set off this festival as well as anything can. You wrote once, and again I apologize for my translation, "I am not alone. I know 1,000 times over that I am not alone. I only exist physically, intellectually, morally, because of millions of others who exist and have existed around me. This isn't an abstract idea. It's a slice of life, a simple part of reality. And to those others, I owe everything, absolutely everything. My name, my address, my nose, my skin, the color of my hair, my life and my most secret thoughts, my dreams, and even perhaps the place and hour of my death. And in the same manner that I've been formed, I form and I make. I am at the same time father, brother, friend, creator, destroyer, murderer, who knows? To be born is to be plunged into a small universe where the relations are without number, where each detail, each second that passes is important and leaves its traces." That seems to me to be as good a motto for what literature is and for what a literary festival can encourage as any words I know. Thank you for your eloquence.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presence. And thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you. And thank you for being here.